the frozen wasteland of a Nordic winter, a king walked with his most unusual companion, a white lion whose loyalty had never wavered, whose instincts had never failed. But on this morning, the magnificent beast stopped dead in the snow and released a sound the king had never heard before. Not a roar of warning, not a growl of aggression, a wail of recognition, of grief, of something impossible. Because lying half dead in the drifts was a woman the lion knew, though she had been declared dead 12 years ago. A woman with storm-gray eyes and scars that told stories of unspeakable suffering. A woman who opened her mouth to speak but produced only silence. A silence that held secrets powerful enough to destroy kingdoms. The king had no idea that saving her life would force him to choose between his crown and his conscience. Had no idea that her muteness hid not weakness, but a truth so devastating that someone had spent over a decade ensuring she could never speak it aloud. Had no idea that the monster who had stolen her voice was closer than he imagined, weaving a web of lies so intricate that even justice itself might become a trap. Because some secrets don't just haunt the past. Some secrets reach forward with claws sharp enough to tear apart everything you thought you knew about honor, family, and the very blood running through your veins. And when she finally screamed the truth that had been locked inside her for 12 years, the sound would shatter more than just silence. It would shatter kingdoms. But first, she had to remember how to make a sound at all. The snow fell like broken promises that winter morning, each flake carrying the weight of forgotten oaths. King Magnus of Nordheim walked through the frozen forest with his white lion, Frost, whose alabaster mane caught the pale sunlight like strands of pure silver. The animal moved with unnatural agitation, its massive paws crushing the snow in erratic patterns that made the king's chest tighten with inexplicable dread. Something was wrong. Frost had never behaved this way, not in the 7 years since Magnus had received him as a cub from a treaty he could barely remember. A promise made when he was just a boy of 10, too young to understand the weight of royal obligations. The lion suddenly stopped, its entire body going rigid. A low growl rumbled from deep within its throat, but it wasn't a sound of aggression. Magnus had heard Frost growl at enemies, at wild boars, at approaching storms. This was different. This sound carried something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Recognition mixed with anguish, like a mother finding a child she thought was dead. The king's hand instinctively went to the sword at his hip, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as his heart hammered against his ribs. Then he saw her. A young woman lay crumpled in the snow like discarded fabric, her body curled into itself in a desperate attempt to preserve warmth that had long since abandoned her. Her lips were blue, almost purple, and her skin had taken on the translucent quality of ice. But what seized Magnus's attention, what made his throat constrict and his stomach drop, was the way Frost reacted. The lion let out a sound the king had never heard before, a keening wail that seemed to split the morning silence, and lunged forward, not to attack, but to curl its enormous body around the frozen woman, as if trying to breathe life back into her with its own warmth. Magnus stumbled forward, his thick fur cloak catching on frozen branches as questions exploded in his mind like arrows released from 1,000 bows. Who was she? Why was Frost acting as though he knew her? The king dropped to his knees beside them, his hands shaking as he pressed 2 fingers against her neck, searching for a pulse he was certain he wouldn't find. There, faint, irregular, like the flutter of a dying moth's wings. She was alive, barely. Her eyelids flickered but didn't open, and Magnus noticed something that made his blood run colder than the wind cutting through the trees. Her hands, clutched against her chest, were covered in old scars, thin, deliberate lines that spoke of restraints, of being bound for long periods. These weren't the rough hands of a peasant woman. The skin beneath the damage was too soft, the fingers too delicate. He scooped her into his arms, shocked by how little she weighed, as if suffering had hollowed her out from the inside. Frost pressed against his leg, whimpering with an urgency that bordered on panic. The lion kept nudging the woman's face with his massive head, each touch gentle despite the creature's size, and Magnus felt something twist in his gut. a memory just beyond reach, like trying to grasp smoke. Why did this feel significant? Why did every instinct scream that this moment would change everything? The journey back to the castle took less than half an hour, but it felt like crossing through years. Magnus held the woman against his chest, feeling her shallow breaths against his neck, each one a small miracle. Frost walked so close that the king nearly tripped several times, the lion's eyes never leaving the woman's face. Guards at the castle gates froze when they saw their king approaching with the strange bundle, but Magnus's barked orders sent them scattering. He needed the royal physician immediately. He needed warm water, blankets, the private chamber in the East Tower, the one his mother had used, the one with the massive fireplace and thick tapestries that held heat like embracing arms. As servants rushed to prepare the room, Magnus laid the woman on his own bed temporarily, unwilling to let her out of his sight. Her eyes suddenly opened, just a crack, and the color struck him like a physical blow. Pale gray like winter dawn, like the eyes of someone who had stared into darkness and refused to be consumed. She looked directly at him, and in that gaze he saw something that made his chest ache. Terror, absolute, bone-deep terror. Then she tried to speak, her mouth opening, her throat working, tendons straining in her neck with desperate effort. No sound came. Nothing. Her lips formed shapes, urgent and frantic, but silence wrapped around her like chains. Magnus leaned closer, his heart thundering. "Don't try to speak. You're safe now. I'm King Magnus, and you're in my castle. You're safe." But even as the words left his mouth, he saw the disbelief in her eyes, the kind of disbelief that comes from promises broken so many times that the concept of safety becomes meaningless. A single tear slid down her temple, cutting through the frost still clinging to her skin, and she lifted one trembling hand. For a moment, Magnus thought she might touch his face, but instead, her fingers went to her own throat, pressing against it as if trying to force sound from a source that had long since run dry. Then her eyes rolled back, and consciousness left her again. The royal physician, Master Aldrich, arrived within minutes, his face flushed from running. He was a thin man in his 50s with clever eyes and steady hands, and Magnus had trusted him for years. But the moment Aldrich entered the room, Frost's behavior changed again. The lion, which had been lying beside the bed with its head near the woman's hand, suddenly stood. The growl that emerged was nothing like before. This was pure warning, the sound of a predator preparing to kill. Frost placed his body between Aldrich and the woman, teeth bared, every muscle coiled tight. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said carefully, not moving, "I cannot treat her if the beast won't allow me near." His voice was calm, professional, but Magnus caught something in his eyes. Just a flicker, gone so fast he almost missed it. Was it recognition? Fear? The physician's right hand had twitched toward his medical bag, then stopped, as if reconsidering. Magnus grabbed Frost's mane, trying to pull the lion back, but the animal wouldn't budge. "Frost, down. He's here to help her." The lion looked at Magnus, and in those animal eyes, the king saw something impossible, pleading, warning, the unmistakable message of danger. Magnus's mind raced. Frost had never reacted this way to Aldrich before. The physician had treated hunting wounds on the lion itself. What had changed? Perhaps, Aldrich suggested, his voice too smooth. The animal is simply protective of an injured creature. If your Majesty would remove him, I can begin treatment. Time is critical. He took one small step forward, and Frost lunged, stopping just short of the physician's throat, saliva dripping from exposed fangs. In that frozen moment, Magnus made a decision that defied logic. "Get out." His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute command. Aldrich's eyebrows shot up. "Your Majesty, she'll die without treatment. The cold has—" "I said get out. Send for Sister Helena from the monastery. She can treat cold sickness as well as any physician." Magnus didn't know why he was doing this, didn't understand the certainty flooding his veins, but every instinct told him to trust Frost's judgment. Go. Now." As the physician left, his face carefully neutral but his eyes glittering with something dark, Magnus turned back to the woman. She was shivering violently now, a good sign. It meant her body was trying to warm itself. He pulled furs over her, added logs to the fire, and sat on the edge of the bed. Frost immediately settled back into his protective position, and Magnus reached out, touching the lion's head. "Who is she, old friend?" he whispered. "Why do you know her?" The lion's eyes met his, and Magnus could have sworn he saw an answer there, just beyond the barrier of speech. Then Frost did something extraordinary. The lion carefully took the edge of the woman's sleeve in his teeth and pulled, exposing her inner forearm. There, faded but still visible, was a small birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. And, suddenly Magnus remembered. A treaty. A marriage pact. A little girl with gray eyes who had held his hand during the ceremony, both of them children playing at adult promises. Her name had been... What was her name? The memory slipped away like water through his fingers, but the mark on her arm matched the description in the treaty documents sealed away in the royal archives. Documents he hadn't looked at in 17 years. This wasn't just any dying woman. This was his forgotten bride, returned from what everyone assumed was death. And someone in his castle, someone trusted, didn't want her to survive the night. Sister Helena arrived as dawn broke over the castle walls, her weathered face creased with concern, and her herb-stained fingers already reaching for the woman's wrist before she'd even removed her cloak. The nun was 60 years old, with silver hair tucked beneath a simple wimple and eyes that had witnessed more death than most soldiers. She worked in silence for several minutes, checking the woman's breathing, her pulse, the color returning slowly to her extremities. Frost watched every movement with unwavering attention, but unlike his reaction to Master Aldrich, the lion remained calm, almost approving. Magnus stood by the window, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached, watching the monastery sister's face for any sign of hope or despair. "She'll live," Helena finally said, her voice rough from years of prayer in cold chapels. The cold didn't reach her. "Heart thanked the merciful Lord, but your majesty, these marks on her body." The nun's hands trembled slightly as she gestured to the scars visible on the woman's wrists and collarbone, some old and faded, others still pink with relative newness. "This woman has been tortured, systematically. Over years, I'd wager. And there's something else." Helena's eyes met Magnus's, and he saw pity there that made his stomach turn. "She's malnourished in a way that speaks of deliberate starvation. Someone didn't just hurt her, your majesty. Someone tried to break her completely." Magnus felt rage ignite in his chest like oil meeting flame, spreading through his veins until his hands shook with the need to destroy whoever had done this. But beneath the anger was something worse. Guilt. If this woman truly was the girl from the treaty, the child bride his father had promised him to, then her suffering had happened while he lived in comfort, completely unaware of her existence. He had forgotten her. The entire kingdom had forgotten her, and someone had taken advantage of that forgotten status to do unspeakable things. "Can she speak?" Magnus asked, though he already knew the answer. "I saw her try earlier. Nothing came out." Helena moved to the woman's throat, gently probing the area around her larynx with experienced fingers. The unconscious woman flinched even in sleep, a reflexive terror that spoke of hands around her neck in the past. "There's no physical damage that would prevent speech. No scarring on the vocal cords that I can feel externally. This is something else, your majesty. Trauma can lock the voice away just as surely as a blade can cut it. I've seen it twice before. Women who witnessed such horrors that their minds simply closed that door, sealed it shut." The nun's expression hardened. Or perhaps someone made her believe she couldn't speak, convinced her through repeated punishment that silence was her only option for survival. Before Magnus could respond, a knock echoed through the chamber. His captain of the guard, Sir Brennan, entered with his helmet tucked under one arm and concern etched across his scarred face. The man was 45, loyal as stone, and had served Magnus's father before him. "Your Majesty, Master Aldrich is demanding an audience. He's quite insistent that he be allowed to examine the patient. He's brought the matter before the council, claiming you're letting emotion override medical necessity." Brennan's tone made it clear whose side he was on, but duty required he deliver the message. Magnus's eyes narrowed. "The council convenes without my summons now?" His voice was dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded executions. "And since when does my physician dictate where I seek medical care?" But even as he spoke, Magnus felt the political trap closing around him. Master Aldrich was nephew to Lord Halvard, the most powerful noble on the council, a man who already questioned Magnus's rule at every opportunity, claiming the young king was too soft, too idealistic. Refusing Aldrich access could be twisted into a sign of instability, of a king making irrational decisions. Sister Helena stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "If I may speak plainly, Your Majesty, that lion knows something we don't. Animals sense evil in ways we've forgotten. If Frost won't allow the physician near her, there's a reason." She glanced at the white lion, who had risen at the knock on the door and now stood with his body blocking the bed, as if anticipating another attempt to reach the woman. "I've treated enough nobles to know that power and medicine can be twisted into poison. Perhaps you should ask yourself why Master Aldrich is so insistent. A physician has many patients. Why does this one matter so much?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle, and Magnus felt pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed start to shift in his mind. Why was Aldrich so determined? The man had seemed almost offended when dismissed, but more than that, there had been urgency in his eyes, the kind of urgency that came from fear rather than medical concern. What was the physician afraid of? That she might recover, that she might speak even if everyone believed she couldn't. Magnus made a decision that would ripple through the coming days like a stone thrown into still water. "Sir Brennan, I want you to personally search through the royal archives. Find the treaty documents from 17 years ago, the marriage pact between Nordheim and the Duchy of Eisenmoor. I want to know every detail of that agreement, and I want to know what happened to the Duke's family." He moved closer to the bed, looking down at the woman's face, peaceful now in healing sleep. "And do it quietly. Tell no one what you're searching for, not even the council." Brennan's eyes widened with understanding, and he glanced at the woman with new recognition. "The lost Duchess," he breathed. "The rumors said she died in a fire with her mother when she was just a child. 12 years ago, it must have been. But if she's alive..." The implications stretched out before them like a road with no visible end. If she was alive, if she was the rightful Duchess of Eisenmoor, then the current Duke, who had claimed the title after the tragic fire, was either a usurper or had questions to answer about how his niece had ended up scarred and mute in a frozen forest. "Go," Magnus commanded, "and send word that I'll address the council this afternoon. They want explanations. They'll get them, but on my terms." As Brennan left, Sister Helena began preparing a tincture of herbs that would help the woman rest without nightmares. Magnus watched her work, his mind racing through political calculations and emotional landmines. If this woman was indeed his forgotten bride, he had a legal obligation to honor the treaty. But more than that, something in him wanted to honor it, wanted to protect her, wanted to find whoever had hurt her and make them understand what true suffering meant. The woman stirred then, her eyes fluttering open. This time consciousness stayed. She looked at Magnus with those storm-gray eyes, and he saw awareness flood into them, not just of her surroundings, but of him, of recognition. Her lips trembled, forming a single word that he could read even without sound, a name. His name. She knew who he was, had always known, and the tears that spilled down her cheeks weren't from physical pain. They were from something infinitely worse. Betrayal. The kind that comes from being forgotten by the one person who had promised to remember. Magnus knelt beside the bed, his throat tight. "I don't know your name," he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I don't remember your face from that day. I was 10 years old and I forgot you. But I swear on my father's grave, on the crown I wear, on everything I hold sacred, I will remember now. I will find out what happened. To you, and whoever did this will answer for it." She stared at him for a long moment, and he saw her weighing his words, measuring them against years of broken promises from other men. Then, slowly, she lifted her right hand. Her fingers were shaking so badly, Magnus thought she might collapse from the effort. But she pressed her hand flat against her heart, then extended it toward him, palm up. It was a gesture from the old treaty ceremonies, one he barely remembered. A pledge of trust offered, waiting to be accepted or rejected. Magnus took her hand in both of his, feeling how cold her fingers still were, how fragile the bones felt beneath skin that had known too much pain. "I accept your trust," he said formally, using the words from the ancient ritual. "And I offer mine in return. What was broken will be mended. What was forgotten will be remembered. What was stolen will be reclaimed." Her eyes closed, fresh tears streaming, but he felt her fingers tighten around his. The smallest. Pressure, barely there, but enough. Enough to say she chose to believe him, even if every experience she'd had told her belief was foolish. Frost moved then, placing his massive head on the bed between their joined hands. And Magnus understood. The lion had been hers first, a gift to a child duchess from a child king. And somehow, through everything, the animal had never forgotten, had been waiting all these years for her return. From somewhere in the castle below, Magnus heard the council bell, ringing, summoning him to face questions he couldn't fully answer yet. But he didn't move. He stayed there, kneeling beside the bed, holding the hand of a woman whose name he still didn't know, while Frost kept watch and Sister Helena hummed an old hymn about redemption. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, and Magnus wondered how many other forgotten promises lay buried beneath those white drifts, waiting for spring to reveal their consequences. The council chamber felt like a tomb. That afternoon, all cold stone and colder stairs. 12 men sat around the ancient oak table, their faces carved from suspicion and political calculation. Magnus entered with his shoulders squared and his crown feeling heavier than usual, aware that every eye tracked his movement like predators watching wounded prey. Lord Halvard sat at the far end, his silver beard braided in the style of old warriors, though the man hadn't lifted a sword in 20 years. His nephew, Master Aldrich, stood behind him like a shadow, and Magnus noticed how the physician's hands kept clenching and unclenching, knuckles white with tension that seemed excessive for a mere professional dispute. "Your Majesty," Lord Halvard began without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. "We must discuss this morning's incident. You dismissed the royal physician in favor of a monastery nun. You've locked yourself in chambers with an unknown woman of questionable origin. And now we hear rumors that you've set Sir Brennan to searching the archives for documents that should concern the entire council." He leaned forward, and Magnus saw the challenge in those pale blue eyes. "The kingdom requires transparency from its king. We require explanations." Magnus remained standing, a deliberate choice that forced them all to look up at him. "The woman I found in the forest is under my personal protection. Her medical care is my concern, not the council's. As for the archives, I'm researching a matter of historical treaty law. When I have findings worth sharing, you'll be informed." His tone left no room for debate, but he saw Lord Halvard's jaw tighten with barely suppressed anger. The old lord wasn't accustomed to being dismissed, especially not by a king who had only held the crown for 3 years. "Historical treaty law," Lord Halvard repeated, tasting the words like spoiled wine. "How convenient. And does this historical research have anything to do with the Duchy of Eisenmoor?" The question landed like a blade between ribs, precise and devastating. Magnus felt his blood turn to ice. How did Halvard know? The connection hadn't been confirmed yet, and Magnus had told only Brennan. Unless someone else had already made the same leap of logic, unless someone had been expecting this exact situation. Before Magnus could respond, the council chamber doors burst open. Sir Brennan stood there, his face flushed from running, a leather document case clutched against his chest like a A shield. Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but you need to see this immediately. The captain's eyes darted to Lord Halvard, then back to Magnus, and in that glance, the king read volumes. Whatever Brennan had found, it was explosive enough to warrant breaking council protocol. Magnus gestured for him to approach, aware of how every council member leaned forward, trying to glimpse the documents. Brennan handed over a single sheet of parchment, yellowed with age but perfectly preserved. The royal seal of Nordheim was pressed into red wax at the bottom, beside another seal Magnus recognized with a jolt, the crowned wolf of Eisenmoor. His eyes scanned the formal treaty language, the promises of alliance through marriage, and then he found the name that made his heart stutter. Lady Astrid of Eisenmoor, daughter of Duke Wilhelm, age 7, betrothed to Crown Prince Magnus of Nordheim, age 10, marriage to occur upon her 18th birthday. But it was the notation at the bottom, added in different ink and dated 12 years ago, that made Magnus's hands shake. Duchess Astrid and her mother, Duchess Helena, perished in fire at Eisenmoor Castle on the night of the winter solstice. Treaty considered void due to death of contracted party. Signed, Duke Gerard of Eisenmoor, acting regent and uncle to the deceased. The signature was bold, confident, the signature of a man claiming power without hesitation, and below it, barely visible, was a second notation in cramped handwriting. Bodies never recovered, declared dead by decree after 3 months. Magnus looked up at Lord Halvard, and suddenly the pieces fell into a pattern that made his stomach churn. Your wife, he said slowly, watching the old lord's face, is sister to Duke Gerard of Eisenmoor, is she not? It wasn't really a question. Magnus had known this fact for years but had never considered it significant. Now it felt like standing on a bridge and discovering the supports were rotten. Halvard's expression didn't change, but Aldrich behind him went pale. The physician's mouth opened, then closed, and Magnus saw fear bloom in those eyes like blood spreading through water. My wife's family connections are a matter of public record, Your Majesty. I fail to see the relevance. But Halvard's voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, replaced by the careful tone of a man navigating a suddenly unstable floor. The relevance, Magnus said, his voice cutting through the chamber like winter wind, is that the woman currently recovering in my castle bears the crescent moon birthmark described in this treaty, the same birthmark that identifies members of the Eisenmoor ducal line. The relevance is that she was found half frozen in my forest, covered in scars that speak of years of imprisonment and torture. And the relevance is that if she is indeed Lady Astrid, then Duke Gerard's claim to Eisenmoor is based on a lie that several people in this very room might have helped maintain. The silence that followed was absolute. Magnus could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the slight wheeze in old Lord Terrence's breathing 3 seats away. Then chaos erupted. Council members shouted questions, accusations, denials. Lord Halvard stood so fast his chair toppled backward, his face flushed purple with rage or panic or both. You accuse me of treason based on a birthmark? On the ravings of some forest vagrant who cannot even speak to identify herself? His voice boomed through the chamber. This is madness, Your Majesty. You've lost your senses over a pretty face and a tragic story. But Magnus wasn't watching Halvard anymore. He was watching Aldrich. The physician had gone from pale to gray, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chamber's chill. The man's eyes darted toward the door, then back to his uncle, a calculation happening behind them that Magnus could almost see. Aldrich knew something, had done something, and the panic in his face suggested it was worse than anyone had yet imagined. Master Aldrich, Magnus said softly, and the entire chamber fell silent again. There was something in the king's tone that promised violence barely restrained. You seemed very eager this morning to examine the patient, unusually eager. Why? The physician's throat worked. I am the royal physician. It's my duty to. Frost wouldn't let you near her. Magnus took a step toward him, and Aldrich retreated until his back hit the stone wall. My lion, who has never shown you anything but tolerance, was ready to tear out your throat to keep you away from that woman. Why would that be, I wonder? Aldrich's eyes flicked to his uncle, seeking rescue or permission or both, but Halvard had gone very still, his earlier bluster evaporating as he stared at his nephew with dawning horror. "Aldrich," the old lord said quietly, "what did you do?" "I did what needed to be done," Aldrich burst out, his voice climbing toward hysteria. Gerard paid well for assurance. Paid well for continued assurance over the years. I didn't know who she was at first, not until I saw her again this morning. But Gerard needed confirmation that she could never speak, could never identify herself or him or... He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize he had said too much, but the damage was complete. Magnus felt rage white-hot and pure flood his system. "You were the one who made her mute. You did something to her. It wasn't a question. And you've been working for Gerard of Eisenmore all along, ensuring his stolen duchy remained secure." Sir Brennan moved then, his sword sliding free with a whisper of steel. 2 other guards appeared at the doors, summoned by some signal Magnus hadn't seen. Aldrich looked wildly around the chamber, seeking escape or allies, but found neither. His uncle had sunk back into his chair, face buried in his hands, association with treason, destroying decades of careful political positioning in mere moments. "I was 23, Aldrich Key whispered, and now there were tears streaming down his face, pathetic and too late. "Gerard came to me after the fire, said there was a girl who had survived, a girl who had seen things she shouldn't have seen. He just wanted me to give her something to make her forget, to make her sleep deeply for a while. I didn't know he planned to lock her away for years, didn't know he was starving her, breaking her. By the time I understood, I was too deep in his debt. He owned me." Magnus's hands clenched, so hard his nails drew blood from his palms. "What did you give her?" Each word was carved from ice and fury. "What did you do to her voice?" Aldrich's laugh was broken, the sound of a man watching his life collapse. "Nothing. That's the beautiful horror of it, Your Majesty. I gave her nothing. The muteness is psychological. Her mind locked her voice away to protect her from Gerard's questions. She did it to herself, and Gerard let everyone believe it was permanent, convinced her it was permanent, through years of isolation." His eyes met Magnus's, and there was a terrible understanding there. If she ever feels safe enough, if she ever truly believes she's free, her voice will return, and she'll tell everyone what Gerard did, what he is. That's why I needed to examine her this morning. Gerard sent word that if she survived, I was to ensure she never woke up. The implications crashed over Magnus like a collapsing wall. Aldrich had been ordered to murder Astrid while she lay helpless in the castle. Would have murdered her, if not for Frost's inexplicable protection. And if her voice could return, if she could speak, then she was in more danger now than she had been in that frozen forest. Because Gerard would send others, would stop at nothing to silence the one witness to whatever crime had occurred 12 years ago in that fire. Magnus looked at Brennan. "Take him to the dungeons, separate cell, no contact with anyone, and send riders to Eisenmore immediately. I want Duke. Gerard brought here in chains to answer for his crimes." As guards seized Aldrich and dragged him from the chamber, his screams of protest echoing off stone walls, Magnus turned to the remaining council members. "We will reconvene tomorrow. Anyone with connections to Duke Gerard should consider very carefully what you choose to disclose in the coming hours. Cooperation will be remembered. Obstruction will be punished as treason." He let that threat hang in the air, then strode from the chamber, without waiting for response or dismissal. His feet carried him back to the East Tower room where Astrid lay, his mind reeling with revelations and rage, and a growing fear he couldn't name. Sister Helena looked up as he entered, concern creasing her features. "Your Majesty, she's been restless. Nightmares, I think, though she hasn't woken." Magnus moved to the bedside, looking down at Astrid's face, peaceful now but marked by the slight frown of troubled dreams. Frost raised his head, those intelligent eyes meeting Magnus's, and the king could have sworn the lion understood everything that had just transpired. "Her name is Astrid," Magnus said softly, speaking to the nun but looking at the sleeping woman. and someone very powerful wants her dead before she can remember how to scream. Astrid woke to firelight dancing across unfamiliar stone walls and the weight of something warm pressed against her side. Her body tensed instinctively, every muscle coiling for defense or flight. Before she realized the warmth was Frost. The white lion's breathing was slow and steady, his massive body curled protectively around her like a living fortress. Memory crashed through her in fragments, snow, cold that felt like knives in her lungs, the certainty of death, and then eyes. Blue eyes she had seen only once before, 17 years ago, when she was a child in a white dress, holding the hand of a boy who promised to protect her forever. The boy who had forgotten she existed. She tried to sit up, but her body betrayed her with weakness that made her arms shake. How long had she been here? Days, hours. The light streaming through the window suggested late afternoon, but she couldn't trust her perception. Time had become meaningless during her years in Gerard's dungeon, where day and night blurred into one endless twilight of suffering. Her throat felt raw, not from injury, but from the phantom sensation of screaming that never came. She opened her mouth, tried to force sound. Past the barrier that had lived in her larynx for 12 years, but nothing emerged except a whisper of breath. The silence mocked her, as it always did. Frost stirred, his golden eyes opening to regard her with an intelligence that seemed almost human. He made a low sound, not quite a growl, more like a question, and pressed his massive head against her hand. Astrid felt tears burn behind her eyes. This lion remembered her, had recognized her immediately, even though she barely recognized herself. She had been 7 years old when her mother presented Frost to Magnus as part of the treaty gifts, a cub so small she could hold him in her arms. They had played together that day, she and Magnus and the lion, running through gardens that smelled of summer roses. She had believed in fairy tales then, believed that marriage to a kind prince would be her future, that love could grow between two children who shared laughter and promises. Then the fire came. Not a real fire, she understood. Now with adult clarity. The fire was a lie Gerard told the world, while he locked her in darkness, and made her wish for actual flames that might end the suffering. He had appeared in her chambers that night, with men whose faces she could no longer recall, had pressed a cloth soaked in something bitter over her mouth until the world went black. She woke in a cell carved from stone, and Gerard's voice explained with patient cruelty that her mother was dead, that her father had died years before, and that she was no longer Lady Astrid of Eisenmoor. She was nothing, no one, a ghost who would disappear completely if she ever tried to speak. The door opened, pulling Astrid from her spiraling thoughts. King Magnus entered, and her breath caught at the sight of him. He had grown from that gangly boy into something powerful, all broad shoulders and controlled strength. But it was his eyes that struck her. They still held kindness, despite the crown that must have taught him cruelty. He stopped. When he saw she was awake, and something crossed his face. Relief mixed with guilt so profound it made her chest ache. "You're awake," he said, and she heard how carefully he chose his words, as if speaking to a wild animal he didn't want to spook. "How do you feel?" He moved closer, slowly, and Frost watched but didn't growl. The lion's acceptance seemed to give Magnus confidence, and he knelt beside the bed, bringing himself to her eye level. "I know who you are now. Astrid, I found the treaty. Documents. I'm so sorry I forgot you. I'm so sorry for everything that happened after." Astrid stared at him, trying to reconcile this grown man with the boy and her memories. She wanted to rage at him, to make him understand the depth of his betrayal through abandonment. But she also saw the genuine pain in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly, and she recognized someone carrying guilt they hadn't earned. He had been 10 years old. What could a child have done against men like Gerard? Still, the little girl in her heart screamed that he should have remembered, should have asked about the treaty bride, should have somehow known she was suffering. Magnus seemed to read some of her thoughts in her expression. "I know an apology means nothing. I know I can't undo 12 years of hell. But I swear to you, Astrid, Gerard will answer for what he did. Master Aldrich is in the dungeons. He confessed to being paid by your uncle. confessed that Gerard ordered him to kill you if you survived. I've sent riders to Eisenmoor to arrest Gerard and bring him here in chains." The words should have brought satisfaction, but instead, Astrid felt terror spike through her veins like poison. Gerard was powerful, connected, cunning in ways Magnus couldn't imagine. He wouldn't come quietly, wouldn't allow himself to be arrested like a common criminal. And he had resources, men who owed him favors, nobles who shared his secrets, ways of making problems disappear. She tried to communicate this urgency, her hands moving in frantic gestures that had no meaning because she had never learned formal sign language. Her mouth opened, throat working desperately, but the silence remained absolute. Frustration boiled over, and she grabbed Magnus's hand with surprising strength, pressing his palm against her throat so he could feel the tendons straining, the physical effort of trying to produce sound that wouldn't come. She needed him to understand that speaking wasn't a choice she was making. It was a prison Gerard had built in her mind, brick by brick, year by year, until her own body betrayed her survival. "I know," Magnus said softly, his other hand coming up to cover hers. "Aldrich told me. Your voice is locked by trauma, not injury. He said it could return if you felt safe enough, but I can see you don't feel safe. How could you? You just escaped death. And now I'm telling you we're going after the man who destroyed your life." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Sister Helena suggested we find you parchment and ink. Would you be able to write? Could you tell us what happened that night of the fire?" Astrid's heart hammered against her ribs. Could she write it? The memories lived in her bones, carved into her soul, but putting them into words felt like opening a wound that had never properly healed. Still, she nodded, because what choice did she have? Silence had protected her in Gerard's dungeon, but silence now meant Gerard could craft whatever narrative suited him. She needed to tell her truth, even if her voice remained locked. Magnus called for Sister Helena, who appeared with parchment, ink, and a wooden board to write on. The nun helped Astrid sit up, propping pillows behind her back, and placed the materials in her lap. Astrid picked up the quill with shaking fingers, staring at the blank parchment. Where did she even begin? How did you summarize 12 years of calculated cruelty in a way that would make sense to someone who had never known such darkness? She started with the simplest truth. Gerard killed my mother. The words appeared in script that was shakier than she would have liked, years of malnutrition making her hand control imperfect. I watched through a crack in the wall while he smothered her with a pillow. She fought him. It took a long time. When she stopped moving, he set fire to her chambers to hide the murder. Then he came for me. Magnus read the words over her shoulder, and she heard his sharp intake of breath. When she glanced at his face, she saw rage there so pure it made him look dangerous. Good. She needed him dangerous, needed him angry enough to act decisively. She kept writing, the words flowing faster now, a dam breaking after years of holding back a flood. He locked me in the old dungeon beneath the castle, told me every day that I was dead to the world, that Magnus had been informed of my death and didn't care, that no one would ever come looking for me because no one had ever wanted me. Her hand paused, and fresh tears blurred her vision, but she forced herself to continue. He brought Aldrich to me when I wouldn't stop screaming, made me drink something that tasted like metal and rot. When I woke, my voice was gone. Aldrich told Gerard it was permanent. Gerard believed him, or chose to believe him because a mute prisoner was easier to control. Sister Helena made a sound of distress, her hand coming to her mouth. Magnus had gone very still, the kind of stillness that preceded explosions. Astrid wrote faster, needing to finish before her courage failed. Gerard visited me once a month, always at night. He would stand outside my cell and talk about all the things he had done with my inheritance, all the power he had gained, how respected Duke Gerard of Eisenmoor had become. He told me about the women he married and discarded, the men he ruined, the deals he made in my family's name. He made me watch while he burned my mother's letters, my father's journals, every proof of who I had been. And then one day, he stopped coming. Magnus leaned closer, reading the new words. 6 months ago he stopped. No explanation. Just silence. The guard still brought food, but Gerard never appeared. I thought perhaps he had died, but that seemed too merciful. Then 2 weeks ago the guard stopped coming too. The door to my cell had been left unlocked. I waited 3 days, thinking it was a trap, but nothing happened. So I ran, stole clothes from empty servants' quarters, walked for days through snow. I was trying to reach the monastery, hoping for sanctuary, when the cold took me. She set down the quill, her hand cramping. Magnus took the parchment, reading it again as if hoping the words might change. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Why did he let you go? After 12 years of keeping you prisoner, why unlock the cell and abandon the castle? It was the question Astrid had been asking herself for 2 weeks. She picked up the quill again, wrote 4 words that made her stomach twist with dread. He wants me found. The implication settled over the room like a shroud. Gerard hadn't made a mistake, hadn't shown mercy. He had released her deliberately, knowing she would run, knowing she might make it to civilization, knowing someone might recognize her birthmark or make the connection to the lost Duchess. But why? What possible advantage could Gerard gain from her resurrection? Magnus stood abruptly, began pacing the room with the restless energy of a caged wolf. It's a trap. Has to be. He wants you here, in my castle, for some reason. Wants me to arrest him publicly. He stopped, turned to face her. Astrid, if I bring Gerard here for trial, what happens? What am I walking into? She didn't know. That was the terrifying truth. She didn't know Gerard's endgame, couldn't see the larger pattern he had woven over 12 years. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wrote it in letters large enough to leave no doubt. He's not afraid of you. He should be. But he's not. 3 days passed before the riders returned from Eisenmoor, and those 72 hours transformed the castle into something that felt more like a fortress preparing for siege than a royal residence. Magnus had doubled the guards around Astrid's chambers, placed his most trusted men at every entrance, and moved her to an interior room with no windows, a gilded cage that made her feel simultaneously protected and trapped. She spent the hours writing, filling parchment after parchment with details about Gerard's network, the names of nobles who had visited him in Eisenmoor, the fragments of conversation she had overheard through dungeon walls. Each revelation painted a picture more disturbing than the last. Frost never left her side, his presence a constant comfort that made the stone walls feel less suffocating. Sister Helena came twice daily with broths and medicines designed to restore Astrid's strength, and slowly, painfully, feeling returned to limbs that had forgotten what it meant to be properly nourished. But it was Magnus's visits that Astrid found herself anticipating with an emotion she couldn't quite name. He came every evening as the sun set, sitting beside her bed and reading through her writings with an intensity that made the air feel charged. Sometimes he asked questions. Sometimes he just sat in silence, and she found that silence more communicative than any conversation she had ever had with Gerard. On the 3rd evening, Magnus arrived with Sir Brennan, and both men wore expressions that made Astrid's stomach clench. She sat up straighter, pushing away the bowl of stew she had been attempting to eat, and watched as Magnus pulled a chair close to her bed. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, and she noticed for the first time how the weight of kingship had carved lines around his mouth that made him look older than his 27 years. The riders returned an hour ago, Magnus said without preamble. They found Eisenmoor Castle completely abandoned. Not a single servant, guard, or noble remained. The great hall looked like people had left in the middle of meals, food still on tables, fires burning in hearths. But every document, every record, every piece of correspondence was gone. Gerard cleared out the entire archive. He paused, his jaw working. And he left you a message. Astrid's blood turned to ice. She reached for her parchment and quill, hand already shaking, and wrote a single word. What? Brennan stepped forward, pulling a folded piece of parchment from his jacket. The paper was fine quality, expensive, and sealed with Gerard's personal insignia, the crowned wolf with a bleeding rose in its mouth. Magnus took it, broke the seal with sharp movements, and began to read aloud. "To my dear niece Astrid, the ghost who walks. How delightful that you found your way to King Magnus's protection. I had wondered if you would freeze to death first, but you always were surprisingly resilient. By the time you read this, I will be far beyond your reach, surrounded by allies who value what I can offer them more than they fear your accusations." Magnus's voice grew harder as he continued. "You may tell your king whatever stories you wish about fires and murders and dungeons. Who will believe the traumatized ravings of a woman who cannot speak? Who will trust memories from a child who witnessed events 12 years ago? I have spent those years building an empire of favors and debts, Astrid. Every noble house in 4 kingdoms owes me something. Do you truly think Magnus can touch me without starting a war that will destroy Nordheim?" Astrid felt bile rise in her throat. Gerard's confidence wasn't arrogance. It was calculation. He had planned this moment, perhaps for years, turning her imprisonment into a strategic advantage she couldn't understand. Magnus kept reading, though she could. See how each word cost him. "But I am not without mercy, dear niece. I offer King Magnus a trade. My silence about certain indiscretions, in exchange for your return to my custody. You see, there are documents that survived the fire. Letters between Magnus's father and mine, detailing arrangements that the current king would find most embarrassing, treaties that were broken, promises that were betrayed, gold that was stolen from Eisenmoor's coffers to fund Nordheim's expansion. If Magnus wishes to keep his father's reputation intact, if he wishes to avoid the scandal that would destabilize his rule, he need only deliver you to the border. I will even allow him to save face by claiming you died of your injuries. Everyone wins, except you, of course. But then, you were never meant to win, were you?" The letter ended with Gerard's flourishing signature, and Magnus crumpled the parchment in his fist with such force that his knuckles went white. The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes, heavy with electricity and impending violence. Astrid stared at the crushed letter, her mind racing through implications that made her want to vomit. Gerard was offering Magnus an impossible choice: protect his father's legacy or protect a woman he barely remembered, a woman who brought nothing but political disaster. She picked up her quill with numb fingers and wrote carefully, "What did your father do to Eisenmoor?" Magnus looked at her, and she saw shame, war with anger in his expression. "I don't know. My father died 3 years ago without explaining his relationship with your duchy. But if Gerard has evidence of theft or treaty violations..." He stood abruptly, began pacing. It could be lies, forged documents meant to create leverage, or it could be truth. My father was a good king, but he was also pragmatic. If Eisenmoor was weakening and Nordheim needed resources, he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Brennan cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, we could call Gerard's bluff, refuse the trade and dare him to release whatever documents he claims to have. If they're genuine, we weather the scandal. If they're forged, his credibility is destroyed. And if they're genuine," Magnus said quietly, "the scandal could fracture the kingdom. Give my enemies on the council grounds for challenge. They already question my right to rule because I'm young, because I inherited the crown rather than conquering for it. Add proof that my father was a thief, and I'll have rebellion within months." He looked at Astrid, and she saw something break in his eyes. Gerard has positioned this perfectly. Either way, he wins. Astrid's hand moved across the parchment faster than thought, words spilling out in desperate urgency. "Send me back. Don't let him destroy everything for someone who's already broken. I survived 12 years in his dungeon. I can survive more. Please, don't sacrifice your kingdom for me." Magnus crossed the Yao, distance between them in 2 strides, dropping to his knees beside the bed and taking her face in both hands with a gentleness that made her chest ache. His eyes blazed with something fierce and uncompromising. "No, absolutely not. I already failed you once by forgetting you existed. I won't compound that betrayal by handing you back to the monster who stole your life." His thumbs brushed away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Gerard thinks I'll choose political expedience over doing What's right? He's counting on me being like my father, like him, like every other noble who treats people as chess pieces. But he's wrong. Your Majesty, Brennan said carefully. With respect, we need to consider. There's nothing to consider. Magnus's voice carried the absolute authority of a king who had made his decision and would hear no argument. We find another way. We expose Gerard's crimes so thoroughly that his allies abandon him out of self-preservation. We prove Astrid's identity beyond any doubt and reclaim Eisenmoor through legal means. And if that fails, if Gerard releases his supposed evidence and the kingdom fractures, then so be it. I would rather rule over ruins with my honor intact than sit on a secure throne built on cowardice. Astrid pulled back, shaking her head frantically, and grabbed the parchment again. You don't understand. Gerard doesn't make threats he can't execute. If he says he has evidence, he does, and if you defy him, he won't just destroy your reputation. He'll destroy you. He'll find every weakness, exploit every vulnerability. That's what he does. That's who he is. Magnus read her words, and instead of fear, she saw his expression harden into something that reminded her why he was king. Then let him try. I've spent 3 years trying to rule through diplomacy and compromise, trying to be better than the brutal kings who came before me. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe Gerard needs to learn that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. He stood, straightened his shoulders, and looked at Brennan. Send riders to every kingdom that borders Eisenmoor. I want to know where Gerard is hiding, who's sheltering him, what resources he has access to, and find me a lawyer who specializes in duchy law. If Astrid is the rightful heir, we need legal documentation that's unassailable. As Brennan left to execute the orders, Magnus turned back to Astrid. I need you to write down everything you remember about Gerard's visitors. Every name, every face, every fragment of conversation. We're going to build a case so damning that his allies will be too afraid to stand with him. He paused, his expression softening. I know you're terrified. I know you think this is hopeless. But I promise you, Astrid, Gerard made one critical mistake. She wrote a question mark, and Magnus's smile was sharp enough to cut. He let you go. He gave you to me. And now he's threatening the one thing that will unite my kingdom faster than anything else. The idea that a foreign duke tortured a woman under my protection. Nordheim's nobles might question my rule, but they won't tolerate an outside threat. Gerard just gave me the weapon I need to force unity. Astrid wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that Magnus could outmaneuver a man who had spent 12 years perfecting his strategy. But Gerard's letter had achieved its purpose. It had planted seeds of doubt that grew like poison ivy through her thoughts. She looked at Magnus, this king who barely knew her but was willing to risk everything for principle, and felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that might become trust, if given enough time to take root. She wrote one more line before exhaustion dragged her back towards sleep. Why are you doing this for me? Magnus read it, and his answer was immediate and devastating in its simplicity. Because 17 years ago, I held your hand and promised to, protect you. I may have forgotten that promise, but it doesn't make it any less binding. I failed you then. I won't fail you now. Not even if it costs me everything. Frost raised his head, looking between them, and made a sound that was almost approving. Astrid closed her eyes, Magnus's words echoing in her mind like a prayer or a prophecy. She didn't know which scared her more, the possibility that he meant every word, or the possibility that meaning it wouldn't be enough to save either of them from what Gerard had set in motion. The lawyer arrived on the 7th day, a woman of 50 years with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Her name was Magistrate Alara Thornwood, and she had earned her reputation by successfully challenging 3 duchy succession disputes across 2 kingdoms. She swept into Astrid's chamber like a force of nature, carrying leather cases filled with books and documents, and assessed Astrid with a single penetrating look that seemed to catalog every scar, every weakness, every ounce of determination hidden beneath layers of trauma. Lady Astrid, Ilara said, her voice crisp and businesslike as she settled into a chair across from the bed. "I've reviewed the treaty documents King Magnus provided. Your birthmark matches the description perfectly, but Gerard will argue that many people bear similar marks. We need more. Do you remember anything specific from your childhood that only the true heir would know? Details about the castle? Your parents? Traditions that weren't publicly documented?" Astrid's hand trembled as she reached for her parchment. The memories Ilara wanted had been buried deliberately, pushed down into dark corners of her mind because remembering her life before the dungeon was more painful than remembering the dungeon itself. But she forced herself to think back, to be 7 years old again, running through Eisenmoor's corridors with her mother's laughter echoing behind her. She began to write, slowly at first, then faster as details emerged like stars appearing at dusk. My mother had a music box shaped like a swan. It played a melody composed by my grandmother. The tune was unique to our family, never written down, passed from mother to daughter. When the swan's wings opened, there was a hidden compartment with a ruby that had been in our line for 6 generations. My mother wore it on formal occasions. Gerard would have kept it after her death. The words appeared in careful script, and Astrid watched Ilara's eyes light with professional satisfaction. "Excellent. Physical evidence he can't deny having if he truly inherited your mother's possessions. What else?" The magistrate leaned forward, and Astrid noticed how Magnus, standing by the fireplace, also moved closer, drawn by the pieces of her past she was laying bare. Astrid wrote faster, memories flowing now despite the ache they caused. "There's a portrait in the Great Hall of my grandmother at age 7. I looked exactly like her. Same gray eyes, same crescent birthmark, same small scar above my left eyebrow, from falling off a horse. Gerard had the portrait moved to storage when he took over, but servants would remember it, and the scar is still here." She touched her eyebrow, where a thin white line interrupted the hair growth, and saw recognition flash across Magnus's face. "I remember that portrait," Magnus said quietly, surprising everyone. "I saw it during the treaty ceremony 17 years ago. Your father pointed it out, said you were the image of her reborn. I thought it was just proud father talk, but you really did look identical." He moved to sit on the edge of the bed, studying her face with new intensity. "The scar is still visible, and your eyes. I should have recognized them immediately. They're distinctive, unusual." Ilara made notes with quick, efficient movements. "This is good, very good. Testimony from King Magnus about the portrait, combined with physical evidence only the true heir would possess, creates a compelling case. But Gerard will have counter-arguments prepared. He's had 12 years to build his defense. We need to anticipate his strategy." She fixed Astrid with a look that was almost sympathetic. "Lady Astrid, I need to ask you something difficult. Why do you think Gerard kept you alive all these years? He could have killed you the night he murdered your mother. Eliminated all witnesses, left no loose ends. Why imprison you instead?" The question hit Astrid like a fist to the sternum. It was the mystery that had haunted her through endless dark hours in that cell, the question she had never been able to answer satisfactorily. She picked up the quill, but her hand hovered over the parchment for long seconds before she could force herself to write. "I don't know. Sometimes I thought it was cruelty. He enjoyed having power over me, enjoyed the monthly visits where he could gloat. But that doesn't explain why he fed me enough to survive, why he allowed Sister Helena's predecessor to treat my illnesses when fever nearly killed me twice. It would have been easier to let me die of neglect." Magnus's jaw clenched. "You're saying he kept you alive deliberately, maintained you like property he might need someday?" The disgust in his voice was visceral, and Astrid felt an unexpected warmth toward him for his genuine horror at Gerard's calculated cruelty. "That's my concern," Ilara said, setting down her pen and folding her hands in her lap. "Gerard is a strategist. Everything he does serves a purpose. If he preserved Lady Astrid's life when it would have been safer to end it, he had a reason. And if he released her when he did, knowing she might reach safety and identification, He's executing a plan we don't fully understand yet. She looked between Magnus and Astrid. I believe Gerard wants this trial, wants the public confrontation. The question is why? A knock at the door interrupted them, and Sir Brennan entered with unusual hesitation. His face was pale, and he held a sealed letter with obvious reluctance. Your Majesty, this arrived by Falcon an hour ago. It's addressed to Lady Astrid, but protocol requires I present it to you first, given the circumstances. He handed the letter to Magnus, and Astrid's stomach dropped when she saw the seal. Gerard's crowned wolf, but with a modification that made her blood run cold. The rose in the wolf's mouth was now black instead of red. Magnus broke the seal with sharp movements, his eyes scanning the contents with growing fury. When he finished, he looked at Astrid with an expression that mixed rage and something that looked disturbingly like pity. He knows you're here, knows you've been writing down accusations, and he's offering you a different trade than the one he offered me. Magnus's voice was tight with controlled anger. He says if you return voluntarily, he'll provide you with documents proving your father didn't die of natural causes, as everyone believed. He claims to have evidence that your father was murdered too, and he knows who gave the order. The room spun. Astrid's father had died when she was 4 years old, supposedly of a wasting illness that took him over the course of 6 months. She barely remembered him, just fragments of a kind voice and strong hands lifting her onto his shoulders. The idea that his death had been murder, that someone had orchestrated it while she was too young to understand, opened wounds she hadn't known existed. Her hand shook so badly she could barely hold the quill as she wrote. He's lying, trying to manipulate me. But even as she wrote the words, doubt gnawed at her. Gerard was cruel, calculating, and ruthless, but she had never known him to lie outright. He twisted truth, omitted details, manipulated context, but his facts were always verifiable. It was part of what made him so dangerous. People trusted that his information was accurate even when his intentions were poisonous. Ilara leaned forward, her expression grave. Lady Astrid, if your father was murdered and if Gerard has proof, that information could be explosive. It could reveal conspiracies that extend far beyond one duchy's succession, but it could also be bait in a trap designed specifically for you. She paused, choosing words carefully. Gerard knows you, knows how you think, what motivates you. He's offering you the one thing that might make you abandon safety, answers about your past. Magnus stood abruptly, crumpling the letter in his fist. It doesn't matter. Astrid isn't going anywhere near Gerard, and we're not negotiating with him. Whatever he knows about her father's death can be discovered through investigation. We don't trade her freedom for information. But Astrid saw the calculation in his eyes, the way his mind was working through possibilities, and she realized with sick certainty that he was already considering whether the risk might be worth the potential reward. She grabbed a fresh sheet of parchment and wrote in letters large enough to leave no ambiguity. My father's murder, if it happened, doesn't change what Gerard did to me and my mother. Don't let him redirect the narrative. That's his strategy. Make this about ancient history instead of his crimes. She's right, Ilara said firmly. This is classic misdirection. Gerard wants to turn the trial into an investigation of events from 23 years ago, when Lady Astrid's father died. He wants to muddy the waters, with conspiracy theories and multiple villains making his own crime seem like just one piece of a larger puzzle. It's brilliant, actually. Morally reprehensible, but tactically brilliant. Magnus moved to the window, staring out at the courtyard below where guards drilled with methodical precision. So what do we do? Ignore his offer? Call his bluff? His shoulders were rigid with tension, and Astrid recognized the weight of impossible decisions settling onto him. She had seen that same posture in her mother the weeks before her death, when Duchess Helena had known something terrible was coming but couldn't see how to prevent it. We proceed with the original plan, Ilara said decisively. Build our case, gather witnesses, establish Lady Astrid's identity beyond doubt. When Gerard surfaces for the trial, and he will because that's what he wants, we focus exclusively on what he did. Murder, imprisonment, torture, theft of a duchy. The rest is smoke meant to obscure those flames. She turned to Astrid. Can you do that? Can you face him in open court and maintain focus on your truth, even when he tries to distract you with revelations about your father? Astrid stared at the parchment in her lap, at her own handwriting documenting horrors she had survived. Could she face Gerard? Could she stand in a room with the man who had stolen 12 years of her life and not shatter into pieces? The old Astrid, the girl who had been locked in darkness, would have said no. But something had changed during her week in Magnus's castle. Something had hardened inside her, crystallizing from fear into something that felt dangerously close to rage. She picked up the quill and wrote a single word. Yes. But even as Magnus nodded approval and Alara began outlining the next steps of their legal strategy, Astrid felt a tremor of premonition that had nothing to do with Gerard's threats or her own trauma. Frost, who had been sleeping peacefully by the fire, suddenly raised his head and growled low in his throat. The lion's eyes fixed on the door with an intensity that made everyone in the room fall silent. Then they heard it. Footsteps in the corridor outside. Too many footsteps, moving with the coordinated rhythm of soldiers rather than servants. Sir Brennan was at the door instantly, his hand on his sword. Your Majesty, no one should be in this wing without authorization. He cracked the door open, peered out, and went pale. Your Majesty, you need to see this. Magnus joined him at the door, and Astrid watched his expression transform from confusion to shock to cold, lethal fury. When he turned back to the room, his voice was deadly quiet. Lord Halvard is in the corridor with 20 armed men. He's demanding entrance, claiming authority from the council to take custody of Lady Astrid pending investigation into her accusations. Magnus's eyes met Astrid's, and in them she saw the confirmation of her worst fear. Gerard's allies just made their move. The standoff in the corridor stretched like a wire pulled taut enough to snap. Magnus stood in the doorway with Brennan at his shoulder, blocking entry to Astrid's chamber, while Lord Halvard faced them with 20 men whose armor bore the insignia of various noble houses, a coalition that made Astrid's blood run cold. This wasn't just Halvard acting alone. This was coordination, planning, multiple council members moving in concert to circumvent Magnus's authority. Gerard's web of influence had been woven more thoroughly than anyone had imagined. Your Majesty, Halvard said with false civility that didn't reach his eyes, the council has voted 9-3 in favor of placing Lady Astrid, if that is indeed who she is, into neutral custody until her identity can be properly verified. Surely you see the wisdom in this. Your obvious attachment to the woman clouds your judgment. The council must act to protect the integrity of the investigation. Magnus's voice was ice over steel. The council has no authority to override a direct royal command. I am king, not you, not the council collectively, me. And I have declared Lady Astrid under my personal protection. Any attempt to remove her is treason. He let the word hang in the air like an executioner's axe, but Astrid saw the calculation in Halvard's expression. The old lord had anticipated this response, had prepared for it, and that preparation terrified her more than his armed escort. With respect, Your Majesty, Halvard continued, pulling a scroll from his jacket with theatrical precision. The council has invoked Article 17 of the Royal Charter. When a king's judgment is compromised by personal interest in a matter of succession law, the council may intervene to ensure impartial justice. This article has not been used in 112 years, but the law remains valid. He unrolled the scroll, revealing signatures, 9 of them, each belonging to a council member whose loyalty Magnus had, thought secure. We are not committing treason. We are exercising legal oversight. Astrid's heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't see Magnus's face from her position on the bed, but she saw his shoulders tense, saw Brennan's hand tighten on his sword hilt. Alara moved to stand beside her, one hand resting on Astrid's shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and steadying. Frost had risen to his feet, every muscle coiled, a low, continuous growl rumbling from his chest that raised the hair on Astrid's arms. Article 17, Magnus said slowly, and Astrid heard him forcing control into his voice. requires proof of compromised judgment. You have no such proof. You have accusations and political maneuvering, nothing more. But there was something in his tone that suggested uncertainty, and Astrid realized with dawning horror that he was wondering if they did have proof. Had someone been watching his visits to her chamber? Had his obvious concern for her welfare been documented, twisted into evidence of inappropriate attachment? Halvard smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who had already won. "We have testimony, Your Majesty. Multiple servants report that you visit Lady Astrid's chambers every evening, that you sit beside her bed for hours, that you hold her hand and speak to her with familiarity that exceeds appropriate concern for a subject." He paused, letting the implications settle. Some might call it romantic attachment. Others might call it manipulation of a vulnerable woman. Either way, it demonstrates personal interest that compromises your objectivity. Rage flooded through Astrid so powerfully she thought she might choke on it. They were twisting Magnus's kindness into something ugly, using his compassion as a weapon against him. She grabbed her parchment and quill, began writing with furious speed, but her hands shook so badly the words were barely legible. "He visits because I cannot speak, because I need protection. There is nothing inappropriate. They are lying." Alara took the parchment, read it quickly, and raised her voice to carry into the corridor. "Lady Astrid denies any impropriety. She states that King Magnus's visits have been purely protective in nature. Your testimony from servants is hearsay and intentional misrepresentation." The magistrate's voice rang with professional authority, but Astrid saw doubt flicker across some of the soldiers' faces. Not enough doubt to make them lower their weapons, but enough to suggest Halvard's coalition wasn't as unified as it appeared. "The lady cannot speak," Halvard countered smoothly. "How convenient. She can write whatever King Magnus wishes her to write. That's precisely why neutral custody is necessary, to ensure she's not being coached or coerced." He gestured to his men. "We don't wish violence, Your Majesty. Simply step aside and allow us to transfer Lady Astrid to the monastery, where Sister Helena can continue her care under council supervision. Once her identity is verified and Gerard is apprehended, she'll be returned to your custody if appropriate." The monastery. Astrid's mind raced through the implications. Once removed from Magnus's direct protection, she would be vulnerable to accidents, to poison masked as medicine, to a dozen ways of silencing her permanently while maintaining plausible deniability. Gerard wouldn't even need to show his face. His allies could eliminate her and blame it on trauma, on infection, on the fragility of someone who had suffered so much. And Magnus would be powerless to prevent it, bound by the very laws he was sworn to uphold. She grabbed Magnus's arm, pulled him back from the doorway, and pressed her parchment into his hands. Her writing was desperate, nearly illegible. "Don't let them take me. I will die in the monastery, not from illness, from murder disguised as misfortune. Please, I would rather die fighting here than disappear quietly there." Magnus read her words and something shifted in his expression. When he turned back to Halvard, the calculated control was gone, replaced by raw fury barely leashed. "You want to invoke ancient law? Fine. Then I invoke my right as king to trial by testimony. Article 21 states that any citizen, noble or common, may demand their case be heard in open court before action is taken. Lady Astrid demands that right. Her testimony, written since she cannot speak, will be heard by the full council and all interested parties. Tomorrow at noon in the Great Hall." Halvard's confidence flickered. "Your Majesty, that's highly irregular. The woman is not well enough for—" "The woman," Magnus interrupted, his voice cutting like a whip, "is standing right here, and she is strong enough to face her accusers and defenders alike in open court. Or are you afraid of what she might write when the entire kingdom is watching?" He stepped forward, forcing Halvard back a pace. "You've played your political game well, Lord Halvard. You've used law against me, used my own compassion as evidence of weakness. But you've forgotten one critical detail. I am still king, and tomorrow, in front of everyone, we will see whose truth holds weight." The soldiers shifted uneasily. Open court meant witnesses, meant transparency, meant every word spoken and written would be recorded for history. It was the one thing Gerard's allies couldn't fully control, and Astrid saw panic flash across Halvard's face before he masked it. "Very well," the old lord said stiffly. "Open court at noon, but until then Lady Astrid remains in this chamber under guard. My men will join yours in securing the corridor. For her protection, of course." "Of course," Magnus echoed with bitter irony. How thoughtful. But he didn't argue further, because they both knew this was the best compromise available. Halvard couldn't forcibly remove Astrid without starting a battle in the castle corridors, and Magnus couldn't send Halvard away without appearing to defy lawful council action. So they stood at impasse, armed men filling the hallway, tension thick enough to taste. As Halvard and his soldiers took positions outside the door, Magnus turned back into the chamber. His face was pale, jaw clenched so hard Astrid could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He looked at her with eyes that held apology and determination in equal measure. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "you write your truth. All of it. Every detail you can remember. Names, dates, everything. We turn this open court into Gerard's trial, even though he's not present. We make it impossible for anyone to defend him without defending the indefensible." Ilara was already pulling out fresh parchment, organizing quills and ink pots with efficient movements. "We have 14 hours to prepare your testimony. It needs to be comprehensive but focused, emotional but credible. You'll be writing in front of hundreds of people, Lady Astrid. Nobles who doubt you, servants who are curious, soldiers who will enforce whatever verdict emerges. The pressure will be immense." Astrid took the offered quill, tested its weight in her hand, and felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, but purpose. She had spent 12 years in silence, had let Gerard's voice be the only one that mattered. Tomorrow, even without sound, she would speak. She would write her truth in letters bold enough that no one could pretend not to see them. She began immediately, her hand moving across the parchment with growing confidence. "I am Lady Astrid of Eisenmoor. My uncle, Duke Gerard, murdered my mother on the night I turned 7 years old. I watched him do it. This is my testimony." Magnus pulled a chair beside her, reading over her shoulder as she wrote, and Astrid felt his presence like an anchor in turbulent water. Outside, she could hear Halvard's men settling into guard positions, their weapons and armor creating a symphony of threat. Inside, Frost lay across the doorway like a living barrier, his eyes never leaving the corridor beyond. And between the danger outside and the protection within, Astrid wrote. She wrote through the evening and into the night, pausing only when her hand cramped too badly to continue, then starting again with fierce determination. She wrote about the pillow pressed over her mother's face, about the flames that consumed the evidence, about the taste of the drug Aldrich forced down her throat. She wrote about 12 years in darkness, about Gerard's monthly visits, about the day her voice disappeared and never returned. She wrote about cold stone and moldy bread and the constant terror that this day would be the day Gerard decided she was no longer useful. And she wrote about hope, the tiny, stubborn flame that had kept her alive when death would have been easier. The hope that someday, somehow, someone would remember she existed. As dawn light began filtering through the chamber's high windows, Astrid set down her quill and looked at the stack of parchment she had filled. 17 pages of testimony, each word a small act of defiance, each sentence a rejection of the silence Gerard had tried to impose. Magnus had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed sometime after midnight, his head resting on the mattress near her hand, and she found herself looking at him with complicated emotions she couldn't quite name. He had kept his childhood promise, even after forgetting he made it, had chosen her truth over political safety, had risked his crown to protect someone the world had forgotten. She reached out, let her fingers rest lightly on his hair, and made a silent vow. Whatever happened in the Great Hall at noon, whatever verdict emerged from the testimony and arguments and political maneuvering, She would not let Gerard destroy this man who had shown her that kindness still existed in the world. Even if it cost her the justice she craved, even if it meant sacrificing her claim to Eisenmoor, she would protect Magnus the way he had protected her. Because some debts transcended law and politics and personal desire. Some debts were paid in loyalty that asked nothing in return. Frost raised his head, met her eyes, and she could have sworn the lion understood. Tomorrow would decide everything. Tomorrow would reveal whether truth was stronger than power, whether one woman's written words could stand against the machinations of men who had spent years building empires of influence. Tomorrow would be war fought with parchment instead of swords, and Astrid intended to win. The Great Hall had been transformed into something between a courtroom and a theater, with hundreds of people packed onto benches that had been hastily arranged in rows facing the raised dais where Magnus sat on his throne. Astrid stood at a table to his right, her 17 pages of testimony arranged before her, like armor forged from truth, while Elara stood beside her with the bearing of a warrior preparing for battle. The air was thick with anticipation, and the smell of too many bodies pressed too close together, and Astrid felt her legs tremble beneath the weight of all those eyes fixed on her with curiosity, skepticism, and in some cases, barely concealed hostility. Lord Halvard sat with the council on the left side of the hall, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes glittering with calculation. Scattered throughout the crowd were nobles Astrid recognized from her written testimony, men who had visited Gerard at Eisenmoor, who had shared wine and secrets with the man who had stolen her life. They watched her like wolves watching a wounded deer, waiting to see if she would falter, if the pressure would break what 12 years of imprisonment had failed to destroy. Behind her, Frost lay at the base of the dais, and though Magnus had initially protested bringing the lion into the Great Hall, Astrid had written a single sentence that changed his mind. If I must face them without my voice, let me at least have my only friend who remembers the girl I was. Magnus stood, and the hall fell silent, with the kind of immediate obedience that spoke to genuine respect mixed with healthy fear. He had dressed in full royal regalia, crown, scepter, the ceremonial sword that had belonged to his father, and Astrid understood the message. This was not a casual hearing. This was royal judgment being rendered, and everyone present would be bound by its outcome. We are gathered, Magnus began, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the vast chamber, to hear testimony regarding the identity and claims of the woman known as Lady Astrid of Eisenmoor. She stands accused of being an impostor seeking to profit from tragedy, while simultaneously accusing Duke Gerard of Eisenmoor of murder, imprisonment, and usurpation. Because Lady Astrid cannot speak due to trauma, her testimony has been written. Magistrate Thornwood will read it aloud in its entirety. No interruptions will be tolerated. Elara stepped forward, taking the first page of testimony with hands that were rock steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. Her voice, when she began reading, was clear and unwavering, carrying Astrid's words into every corner of the hall. I am Lady Astrid of Eisenmoor. My uncle Duke Gerard murdered my mother on the night I turned 7 years old. I watched him do it. The words landed like stones into still water, and Astrid saw ripples of shock spread through the crowd. Some people leaned forward, others drew back. But no one looked away. Elara continued, reading Astrid's description of the murder with clinical precision that somehow made it more horrifying than any dramatic embellishment could have achieved. Astrid watched faces in the crowd, saw women pressing hands to their mouths, saw men's expressions harden with anger or, more troubling, with careful blankness that suggested they had known something was wrong but had chosen comfortable ignorance. When Elara reached the part about Gerard smothering the Duchess with a pillow, about how long it took for her mother to stop fighting, Astrid heard someone in the back of the hall begin to weep quietly. The reading took nearly an hour. Elara moved through Astrid's pages with relentless momentum, describing the dungeon, the darkness, the years of isolation punctuated by Gerard's monthly visits. She read about Aldrich's involvement, about the nobles who had visited Eisenmoor and surely must have heard something, seen something, questioned something. and she read Astrid's account of her escape, of stumbling through snow with death closing in, of waking to find blue eyes she had seen only once before but had never forgotten staring down at her with concern that seemed impossible after 17 years of being forgotten. When Alara finally set down the last page, the silence in the great hall was absolute. Astrid's hands were clenched so tightly her nails had drawn blood from her palms, but she kept her chin up, kept her eyes fixed on the crowd, refusing to show weakness even as her entire body shook with the vulnerability of having laid her trauma bare for hundreds of strangers to judge. Magnus's voice broke the silence. Are there any who wish to challenge this testimony, who claim it is fabricated or exaggerated? Lord Halvard stood slowly, and Astrid's stomach dropped. Your Majesty, the testimony is certainly compelling, horrifying even, but it remains the unverified claims of a woman who cannot be questioned, cannot be cross-examined, cannot respond to challenges in real time. How do we know these pages weren't written with King Magnus's guidance? How do we know this isn't an elaborate fiction designed to justify? He stopped abruptly because the great hall doors had burst open. Every head turned to see Sir Brennan striding down the center aisle with 6 soldiers behind him, and between them, stumbling and chained, was a figure that made Astrid's blood turn to ice and fire simultaneously. Gerard. They had captured Gerard. Her uncle stood there in the chains meant for common criminals, his expensive clothes travel-stained and torn, his silver hair disheveled. But his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, found Astrid immediately and held her gaze with an expression that promised this was far from over. Your Majesty, Brennan announced, his voice ringing with triumph, we found Duke Gerard attempting to cross the southern border. He was traveling with forged papers and a wagon full of documents we believe he intended to destroy. We've secured everything. He gestured to soldiers carrying leather cases that bulged with parchment, including what appears to be correspondence proving Lady Astrid's testimony. The hall erupted into chaos. Nobles shouted questions. Council members surged to their feet. But Astrid couldn't look away from Gerard. He was smiling. Not the desperate smile of a captured criminal, but the satisfied smile of a man whose plan was proceeding exactly as intended. And suddenly, with terrible clarity, Astrid understood. He had wanted to be captured, had orchestrated his own arrest to force this exact moment. But why? Magnus's voice cut through the noise. Silence. The command was absolute, and the hall obeyed. He looked at Gerard with an expression of cold fury. You will speak, Duke Gerard. You will explain yourself, and Lady Astrid will hear every word. Gerard's smile widened. Oh, I'll speak, Your Majesty. I'll speak. Truths that will make my dear niece's testimony seem like a pleasant fairy tale. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. Yes, I killed my sister. Yes, I imprisoned Astrid. Everything she wrote is true. I confess it freely without reservation. I am guilty of every crime she has accused me of. The silence that followed was somehow louder than the previous chaos. Astrid felt the world tilt beneath her feet. This was wrong. Gerard never confessed, never admitted fault. This was a trap she couldn't see the shape of yet. Magnus seemed equally thrown. You confess? You admit to murder and— I admit to necessity, Gerard interrupted, and his voice took on the tone of a professor explaining complicated concepts to slow students. I killed my sister because she was going to expose a conspiracy that would have destroyed 5 kingdoms. I imprisoned Astrid to protect her from the people who would have killed her. The moment they learned she existed. Everything I did, every terrible thing, I did to prevent something infinitely worse. Astrid grabbed her quill with shaking hands and wrote in letters large enough for Magnus to read from his throne. He's lying, creating a story to justify. Am I? Gerard's voice was almost gentle. Dear Astrid, you were 7 years old. You saw me kill your mother, but you didn't understand why. Your mother wasn't the saint you remember. She was part of a plot to assassinate multiple monarchs, including King Magnus's father. She was going to use your marriage treaty as access to poison the royal family during the wedding ceremony. I killed her to prevent regicide on a scale that would have plunged the entire region into war." The word struck Astrid like physical blows. No, impossible. Her mother had been kind, gentle, had sung lullabies and told stories, and held her when nightmares came. Her mother couldn't have been an assassin. But doubt wormed its way into her mind because Gerard was holding up documents now, passing them to Brennan. And even from her position she could see her mother's handwriting on the parchment. Her mother's seal pressed into wax. Magnus took the documents with hands that shook slightly. He read in silence, and Astrid watched his expression shift from certainty to confusion to something that looked sickeningly like belief. When he looked up, his eyes found hers, and she saw the question there. Could it be true? These letters, Magnus said slowly, appear to be correspondence between Duchess Helena and known political radicals. They discuss timing, access, methods that would appear natural. He looked at Gerard. If this is true, why didn't you simply report it? Why the deception? Because your father was involved, Gerard said simply, and those 4 words detonated like explosives. Not in the assassination plot, but in covering it up afterward. He knew what Helena had planned, knew I had stopped it, and he paid me handsomely to ensure the truth never emerged, to let everyone believe it was a tragic fire. The gold he sent to compensate me for my loss was actually payment for silence. The treaties he broke with Eisenmore were intentional sabotage to punish me for knowing his failure to prevent the plot in the first place. Astrid's vision blurred with tears that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with rage. Gerard was doing exactly what she had predicted, muddying the truth with conspiracy theories that implicated dead kings who couldn't defend themselves, turning her testimony into just one piece of a puzzle so complex no one could see the simple truth at its center. He had murdered her mother, had stolen her life, and now he was stealing her justice by making himself the hero of a story so twisted that people would spend years trying to unravel it. She wrote frantically, her hand moving so fast the quill tore the parchment. He's manipulating you. This is his plan.
Don't let him turn this into something it's not. My mother loved me, loved her kingdom. She would never... But even as she wrote, she heard murmurs spreading through the crowd. Doubt, uncertainty. The possibility that everything was more complicated than it seemed. Magnus held up his hand for silence, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a king, making a judgment that would echo through history. Duke Gerard, your confession is recorded. Your claims will be investigated thoroughly. But regardless of your motivations, you have admitted to murder and imprisonment. Those crimes demand justice. He paused, and Astrid saw the battle raging behind his eyes. The desire to execute Gerard immediately warring with the need to uncover the full truth. You will remain in custody while we verify your evidence, and Lady Astrid's claim to Eisenmore stands, regardless of what your investigation reveals about the past. Does it? Gerard asked softly, and produced one final document from inside his shirt. Because I have one more truth to share, dear niece. One you deserve to know, even if it destroys you. He held up a parchment covered in official seals and precise handwriting. This is your birth record, the original, not the copy kept in the duchy archives. Look at the father's name, Astrid. Look at who sired you. Ilara took the document, examined it, and her face went pale. She looked at Astrid with an expression of profound pity before reading aloud in a voice that shook. Father, King Edmund of Nordheim. The name hung in the air like poison gas. King Edmund, Magnus's father, which meant Astrid couldn't breathe, couldn't think. If that document was genuine, if her father was actually King Edmund rather than Duke Wilhelm who had raised her, then she and Magnus were... The implications crashed over her in waves. Her mother's plot, the treaty, the marriage arrangement between half-siblings who didn't know they shared blood, the horror of what almost happened if the marriage had proceeded as planned. Magnus had gone absolutely white, his hands gripping the throne's arms so tightly the wood creaked. That's a lie, he whispered,
but there was no conviction in his voice. My father would never— Your father, Gerard said with vicious satisfaction, had an affair with my sister before her arranged marriage to Duke Wilhelm. You have a half-sister, Magnus, and you've been holding her hand, visiting her chambers, looking at her with eyes that suggest feelings far beyond appropriate concern. The whole kingdom has been watching you fall in love with your own blood. He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms. So yes, I imprisoned her, because the alternative was letting the truth emerge and watching two innocents discover they were committing incest through a marriage treaty built on lies. I saved them both from a sin they would never recover from. I am the monster who did monstrous things to prevent something unutterably worse. The great hall exploded into chaos that no amount of royal command could silence. Astrid stared at Magnus, saw the same horror and confusion reflected in his eyes that she felt in her soul. Was it true? Could it be true? Or was this Gerard's final manipulation, his masterpiece of destruction, a lie so perfectly crafted that it would poison everything even if eventually disproven? She reached for her parchment, tried to write, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The quill fell from her fingers, spattering ink across the pages of testimony that suddenly seemed meaningless against the enormity of Gerard's revelation. And then, from somewhere deep inside, past the trauma and the silence and the 12 years of enforced muteness, Astrid felt something break. Not break like shattering, but break like chains snapping. Break like a door that had been locked finally swinging open. Her throat worked, muscles moving in patterns they had forgotten, and sound emerged. Raw, broken, barely recognizable as human. Speech, but sound nonetheless. One word, forced past years of silence through sheer desperate need. No. The hall went silent, every eye fixed on her. And Astrid, who hadn't spoken in 12 years, who had believed she might never speak again, forced more words past the barrier that had held them captive. He lies. Her voice was rusty, cracked, painful to produce, but it was hers. My mother loved Duke Wilhelm. I remember them together, laughing, happy. Gerard lies, always lies. Each word was agony, each syllable a battle won through sheer force of will. But she kept speaking because silence had protected her in the dungeon, but silence now would let Gerard win. I am Lady Astrid, daughter of Duke Wilhelm, rightful heir, and I claim Eisenmoor. Magnus was on his feet, moving toward her, his face a mixture of awe and anguish. But Frost was faster. The White Lion stood, placed himself between Astrid and Gerard, and released a roar that shook the rafters, a sound of such pure protective fury that even armed soldiers took steps backward. And in that moment, with her voice returning like a weapon reclaimed and her truth finally spoken aloud, Astrid understood what she had to do. She picked up the birth record Gerard had produced, walked to the nearest brazier burning beside the dais, and dropped it into the flames. The parchment caught instantly, curling and blackening, destroying evidence that might have been genuine or might have been the perfect forgery. Some truths don't matter, she said, each word coming easier than the last. Only this: Gerard murdered, Gerard imprisoned, Gerard must pay. The document burned to ash, and with it, any proof of the conspiracy Gerard had tried to weave. Magnus reached her side, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Two people caught in a web of lies and half-truths and political machinations that had started before either of them was born. Astrid, he said softly, and she heard the question in her name. What do we do now? How do we move forward when we don't know what's truth and what's manipulation? She took his hand, felt the warmth of his skin against hers, and made a choice that had nothing to do with law or politics or blood. We choose our truth, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, with each moment of reclaiming the power Gerard had stolen. Gerard is guilty. That is truth. The rest, we decide. Together. And in the great hall of Nordheim Castle, with hundreds of witnesses watching and Gerard's face twisted with fury at having his final manipulation destroyed, King Magnus of Nordheim made a proclamation that would echo through history. Duke Gerard is found guilty of murder, imprisonment, and usurpation. He is stripped of all titles and lands. Lady Astrid of Isenmore is confirmed as rightful Duchess, her claim validated by testimony, evidence, and the courage to reclaim her voice after 12 years of silence. As for the rest, he looked at the burning brazier where Gerard's document had turned to ash. Some questions don't need answers. Some truths matter less than the choice to move forward with honor. Gerard was dragged from the hall screaming about injustice and conspiracies, but his voice faded as he disappeared into the dungeons that would hold him until execution. Astrid stood beside Magnus, her hand still in his, and felt something shift in the air between them. Not romance, not yet, not with so many. Questions unanswered and wounds unhealed. But partnership, understanding. The beginning of trust built not on childhood promises, but on the deliberate choice to believe in each other despite every reason not to. That night, after the crowds dispersed and the castle settled into exhausted silence, Astrid stood at the window of her chamber and looked out at the snow-covered landscape that had nearly killed her weeks before. Frost lay beside her, his warm presence a reminder that some loyalties transcended time and trauma. And somewhere in the castle, Magnus was making arrangements to restore Isenmore to her control, to give her back the duchy Gerard had stolen. She touched her throat, marveling at the ability to speak that had returned in her moment of greatest need. The voice was hers again, rusty but real, and she knew that tomorrow she would use it to begin the work of rebuilding everything Gerard had destroyed. But tonight, she simply stood in silence by choice rather than compulsion, and felt the weight of 12 years finally begin to lift from her shoulders. She had survived, had spoken, had reclaimed herself, and that, she thought, was justice enough for now. The rest, Magnus's feelings, her mother's true history, the question of blood that Gerard had planted like a poisoned seed, could wait. Some battles were won by refusing to fight them, by choosing which truths mattered and which could be left to fade like ash on the wind. Sometimes the greatest prisons are not built from stone and iron, but from silence and fear. Astrid spent 12 years locked away, not just in a dungeon beneath a castle, but in the cage her own trauma had created around her voice. And when she finally broke free, it wasn't through violence or rescue. It was through the choice to speak her truth even when the cost seemed unbearable. Ask yourself this: if you had lived through what she endured, if you had been forgotten by the world and tortured by the one person who should have protected you, would you have found the courage to reclaim your voice? Would you have burned the evidence that might have proven your innocence, choosing instead to define your own truth? Or would the weight of those years have crushed something inside you that could never be rebuilt? Magnus faced an impossible choice: protect a stranger and risk his kingdom, or sacrifice her to maintain political stability. He chose honor over convenience, compassion over calculation, and in doing so, discovered that the promises we make as children often matter more than the ones we make as adults. Gerard believed that monstrous actions could be justified by monstrous circumstances, that cruelty in service of a greater good was somehow noble. But in the end, the only truth that mattered was the simplest one. He had taken a child's life and called it necessary. We all face moments where we must choose between what is easy and what is right. The question is not whether we will face that choice, but whether we will have the courage to choose correctly when our moment comes. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice and truth and the power of reclaiming what has been stolen from you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us that even in the darkest dungeons, hope can survive if we refuse to let it die. Because every voice matters, every truth deserves to be heard, and every person who has been silenced deserves the chance to scream.